Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to TESOL 2250. This is week 3. So I just want to touch on a few things that we discussed at the end of class last Friday. So we were talking about constituents and how constituents fit together to form hierarchies, like what you see here on the screen. Just to kind of reiterate what we talked about in class, remember that the biggest things that we need to look for in a sentence, or the biggest constituents that we need to look for in a sentence, are the noun phrase that functions as the subject and the verb phrase that functions as the predicate. So remember that the subject generally defines a topic and the predicate makes a comment about that topic. So the example sentence that we saw in class was Tina went on a cruise last week. Tina is the subject, a noun phrase subject. And what we are saying about Tina, she went on a cruise last week. So went on a cruise last week is the verb phrase predicate. So we also discussed how we would identify a word's class using the 3 steps: meaning, forms of the word, and distribution. We also discussed that we need to identify the word's function in the sentence. So we're not just going to write noun phrase and verb phrase. We're going to write noun phrase subject separated by a colon and verb phrase predicate separated by a colon. So that's what that NP and VP stand for respectively, noun phrase and verb phrase. So we're going to express both the class and the function of a word in this format: class, colon, function. So our example sentence here is: the students handed their teacher the quizzes. Now in this case, the students is a noun phrase subject. We're going to express it NP colon SUBJ. And handed the teacher their quizzes is going to be a verb phrase predicate. We're going to express that as VP colon pred. So we see here in this sentence that we have some sort of noun phrase followed by some sort of verb phrase. Anytime you have a noun phrase followed by a verb phrase, you have a sentence in English. It doesn't matter what that noun phrase and verb phrase is. It can be something completely nonsense, like the plants slept quietly. Well, I have a noun phrase, I have a verb phrase. That makes a grammatical sentence, even if it is somewhat semantically anomalous, meaning that the meaning doesn't quite make sense to us. Still grammatically acceptable. Okay, so we'll do that in class a little bit more. So there are a few steps that you can take if you're trying to identify the verb phrase predicate of a sentence. And the first test that you can do is called the yes-no question test. Now, with the yes-no question test, you take a sentence and you make it into a yes-no question. Yes-no question being a question you can answer with either a yes or a no answer. So the way that we make yes-no questions is we move an auxiliary verb out of the sentence in front of the subject. And the auxiliary verb, or if it's just a verb, that is going to mark the beginning of the VP predicate. So let's say, for example, we have this sentence: the president will visit Moscow in June. Now, if you're not sure where the VP predicate begins, try to make this into a yes-no question. Now, to do that, automatically, you're going to move will. And you're going to get, will the president visit Moscow in June? And that's your signal right there that will is the beginning of the VP predicate. So we can safely say that will visit Moscow in June is going to be the verb phrase predicate. And there it is. If we divide it into 2 constituents, the noun phrase subject is the president, and the VP predicate is will visit Moscow in June. So in some instances, if you don't have an auxiliary verb, you have to create the auxiliary verb do to make a yes-no question. So for example, if I have the sentence, childhood obesity causes health problems later in life, Well, to make this a yes/no question, we have to say, does childhood obesity cause health problems in life? In other words, we have to create this auxiliary do. And we do it in front of the main verb. So in this case, if we have to create auxiliary do, it's not really a part of the sentence. We're going to say that the VP predicate starts with the word cause. And we can safely say that cause here is a verb and not a noun. So finally, we're just going to move do out of the sentence, and we can say that because we had to create it and generate it, cause is the beginning of the VP predicate. And so there it is again, our noun phrase subject separated from our VP predicate. And we have an additional do in the middle there too, which we just had to generate. So remember, the auxiliary verb is always going to move in front of the entire subject. And that's going to help us to identify what the subject is. So once again, let's say I'm looking at a sentence and I'm not really quite sure what the subject is, or maybe how long the subject is. Well, I can use this exact same test to identify subjects. So let's say I have the sentence, American priorities have changed. Now, in this instance, I'm not sure what my subject is, but to make it a yes/no question, I'm going to move have, and I get have American priorities changed. Now, right away, because I have moved the auxiliary verb around the whole subject, that basically outlines the entire subject for me. And I can see that American priorities is the subject here. And this is true whether you have a very short subject or a very long subject. Let's take a look at the next sentence on the slide. And this is, the researchers who discovered the oncogene are working on a new cancer drug. Now, in this instance, we're going to have to take our auxiliary verb, which in this case is a form of be, are, and we're going to have to move it all the way around the entire subject. And we get, are the researchers who discovered the oncogene working on a new cancer drug? And in this case, that whole thing that's highlighted in blue is a subject. It's not just the researchers, it's the researchers who discovered the oncogene. So this auxiliary movement, or the yes/no question test, is really useful for identifying VP predicates and also noun phrase subjects. So here again is just a quick summary of constituents, just to finish out what we had talked about last Friday. Remember that we are thinking about words as part of slots. Now, the slots identify the function of the word. They tell us what is a subject. They tell us what's a VP predicate, what's a direct object, and so on. And that's defined by how a word or a group of words relates to other words in the sentence. So when we have a slot plus a function, we have a constituent. Now, constituents consist of a head, which is the most important word of the phrase, and then maybe one or more attributes, or maybe none. Those are things that modify the head in various ways. It doesn't necessarily need to be a noun. It could be a verb phrase head, or adjective phrase head, or something like that. A constituent can be very, very long, or it can be very, very short, as long as it meets the qualifying criteria of a constituent category for that slot. So again, we have some examples that we saw in class on Friday. My friend is coming back to town for my birthday. Sarah is coming back to town for my birthday. And my best friend since 7th grade who moved away for last year is coming back to town for my birthday. All of those words in red fill the exact same NP subject slot. Finally, the last little thing was how to identify a word or words function, particularly with respect to noun phrase subjects and verb phrase predicates. And we use that yes/no question test, or in other words, auxiliary verb movement. Okay, so we have been talking about parts of speech. And remember that parts of speech can be divided into content words and function words. Now, with these function words, I only put 3 of the most common function words here: auxiliaries, prepositions, and determiners. And these are things that we've discussed in class and in a few of the videos. However, there are actually many more categories of function words. And I'm going to just show you those here on the screen right now. I just couldn't fit them all very neatly in that diagram, so I put the 3 most common ones. Now we're going to learn about all of these individually as we go throughout each one of the weeks of our term. So rather than just defining every single one of these types of function words and having you forget what all of that means in the future, we're not going to do that. We're just going to define them as we come across them in each one of the weeks, okay? But there they all are, in case you were wondering if there were more function words. Yes, there are. There are quite a few. But we'll see each of these categories of function words as each week goes. Okay, so let's talk about syntax now. Syntax, broadly speaking, is the order of constituents in a given language. And all languages are composed of something called phrase structure rules. These are rules for how constituents are organized and embedded within one another. So we already saw the very first and biggest phrase structure rule, and that is the rule to create a sentence. Noun phrase plus verb phrase equals sentence. And that's what we see here with NP plus VP equals S. So the S always stands for sentence. NP is noun phrase, VP is verb phrase. So any noun phrase plus verb phrase combination is going to give you a sentence, as we saw earlier. Now, there are many other phrase structure rules. We're going to learn all of them. For example, let's take the rule to make a noun phrase. If you want to make a noun phrase, you, at the very minimum, must have just one noun. Now, remember this. Even if it's just one noun, we still call that a noun phrase. So for example, if I say dinner is at 6 o'clock, well, dinner is just one noun, but it's in the noun phrase subject slot. So we have to call it a noun phrase in this case, even if it's just one noun. So here, this phrase structure rule is at the very minimum, we need a noun and we get a noun phrase. But if we add an optional adjective, which is indicated with these parentheses. Parentheses means something is optional. So we get an optional adjective plus a noun, then we're going to get a noun phrase. So let's look at how that plays out in English. Well, I can say there is a red house on the corner, or just there is a house on the corner. House is a noun phrase, and red house is a noun phrase too. So I get any adjective, and then I follow it with a noun. I'm going to have a noun phrase. Now in Spanish, these things are exactly the opposite. Casa roja. I'm going to have first a noun, and then I'm going to have the adjective. Now, when you have any noun and any adjective, Spanish speakers are going to hear that as being a phrase. And so the Spanish phrase structure rule is going to be obligatory noun plus optional adjective equals noun phrase in speakers' minds. So every language has different phrase structure rules, as we see here in the contrast between English and Spanish. But we're going to be concerned primarily just with the English phrase structure rules. So as we embark on our journey of building sentence trees and tree diagramming, we're going to primarily focus on verbs. Everything about a sentence is centered around the verb. And so it's very, very important that we understand verbs very well. And this particular material, you may want to review these videos this week and next week to really make sure you understand the verbs, because the verb is the building block of the entire sentence. So there are 6 types of verbs we're going to discuss. And the result of those 6 verbs is that there are going to be 6 kind of core sentences that we're going to be looking at. Now, we use these 6 core sentences to construct all the other sentences in English. So let's start with our first verb, which is intransitive verbs. We're going to look at number 1 and number 2 today. Intransitive verbs and linking verbs. Now, what you're going to notice is that all of these are going to have an abbreviation. These are things that we're going to put in our tree diagrams when we start to diagram trees on Friday. Now, you'll see I have something called an intransitive verb, but it's labeled as VI and not IV for intransitive verb. Well, the reason that is because we always want to list the overarching structure first and then discuss what the subcategory is after that. So when we're writing it as VI, we are saying this is a verb. What type of verb? Intransitive. Okay, so we're going to always go from more general to more specific when we are labeling our categories. And this is true for our verbs too. So same thing with the linking verb. We're not going to write LV. We're going to say verb first. What type of verb? Linking, VL. Okay. So we will see this screen a lot, and we'll discuss 2 or 3 verbs every single video and every single class period. Okay. So the general rule when you're trying to figure out what type of verb you have is to look left and look right. Much like, before you cross the street, you look left and then you look right. It's the same thing you do with a verb. So I'm looking at the verb sleep, or in this case, it's slept in past tense. Tense doesn't matter. So I'm looking at the verb sleep, and I'm trying to figure out what type of verb I have. Well, I'm going to look, in this case, to the left, and I see that I have my mom slept. So the verb in this instance tells us that the noun phrase that comes before it is the subject of the sentence. So right away I can say, okay, well, I don't have anything following this verb, and there's only a couple of types of verbs that can just end a sentence like that. And we'll see which type that is in a moment. Now, if we look over here on the other side, we see this verb take, in past tense took. So the verb in this instance tells us that the noun phrase that comes after it is the object of a verb. It's a type of verb that requires an object. And there are only 3 types of verbs that require an object. So that narrows down the list from the original 6 that I showed on the previous slide. So you can kind of narrow it down based on what you know about each type of verb. So verbs define the relationships among other constituents. So when we're looking, once again, and trying to figure out what type of verb we have, just as we would cross the street, look to the left, look to the right, and see if you can figure out the relationship between the constituent to the left and the constituent to the right of the verb. Okay, so let's look at number 1 and number 2, intransitive verbs and linking verbs. Okay. So intransitive verbs, the definition of an intransitive verb means does not transfer. Intransitive, does not transfer. In other words, the action of the verb does not transfer onto any kind of direct object noun phrase. And remember, a direct object is a noun phrase that receives the action of the verb. So we saw a little bit of this earlier. I can say, I slept. That's perfectly grammatical. However, I cannot say, I slept a nap. That's ungrammatical. Similarly, I can say, the yeast rose, but I cannot say, it rose the yeast. And that isn't quite grammatical. I can say, the roach died, but I cannot say, the roach died itself. However, in many languages, you can say that. Once again, in Spanish, you can say, se murió la cucaracha, which literally means the roach died to itself, or the roach died itself. So it's important to note that a verb may be a one particular type in one language. It might be a different type in another language. In that case, die in Spanish, morirse, is actually a reflexive verb. It's not in English. It's an intransitive verb. Now, I can also say the mayor spoke. That's all right. I cannot say the mayor spoke a speech. So all of these verbs, sleep, rise, die, and speak, these are all intransitive verbs. You cannot apply the action of the verb onto some sort of direct object. So I said intransitive verbs are not followed by a direct object noun phrase. However, there could be other structures after them. Most notably, there could be some sort of adverb or adverb phrase, or some sort of prepositional phrase that functions as an adverb. So for example, I can say, I slept quietly. Now you might look at quietly and say, oh, that looks like a direct object. But once again, you would recognize quietly as being an adverb. Now, adverb is not a noun phrase, so noun phrases can only be direct objects. Direct objects can only be noun phrases. So we see we have an adverb. This is not a direct object. Same thing here. I slept for 3 hours. Now, I want you to note that prepositional phrases often, well, almost always, have an adverbial function. So, how long did I sleep? For 3 hours. Remember that that prepositional phrase is an answer to a WH question. And if it's an answer to a WH question, it has an adverbial function. The whole phrase, not just the preposition, but the preposition and the object of the preposition. So we're going to notate these kinds of prepositional phrases like you see here on the screen. We're going to write PP for prepositional phrase, colon, adverb. And what this is saying is just, here's a prepositional phrase, that's the structure, and it's functioning as an adverb in the sentence. In fact, some intransitive verbs have to be followed by an adverb in order to make sense. So for example, I can't just say Cadillac's seating system acts. We can't just end a sentence with acts. Nevertheless, the thing that comes after it is not a direct object, but rather an adverb of some sort, or a prepositional phrase functioning as an adverb. We have to say Cadillac's seating system acts like a shock absorber. Still, again, this is not a direct object. So you're going to start to see verb formulae. Much like a math problem, there is a formula for all of our phrase structure rules. We've already seen a little bit of math problems when we were looking at our phrase structure rule, such as noun phrase plus verb phrase equals sentence, things like that. Well, here's another one. We get a sentence when we have a noun phrase subject plus an intransitive verb, possibly with an adverb phrase optionally occurring afterward. So this formula that you see is going to read like this. A complete sentence containing an intransitive verb must have a noun phrase acting as a subject, followed by the intransitive verb. An optional adverb phrase may be added after the verb. So let's look at each one of these again, okay? A complete sentence containing an intransitive verb must have a noun phrase acting as a subject, followed by the intransitive verb, and an optional adverb phrase may be added after the verb. So that's what we see here in this formula. Once again, those parentheses mean that the structure is optional. Now, let's look at linking verbs. Linking verbs, I put a big equal sign at the top of the screen here because I like to think of a linking verb as basically like an equal sign. Linking verbs link together the subject to whatever structure comes after the verb and states that they're equal to each other or equivalent to each other. Linking verbs just don't really have a lot of meaning by themselves, and they're often kind of difficult to define because they're just really there to just link the subject with whatever comes after the verb. For example, if I say, he seems unhappy, the verb seems here is a linking verb. Now, all we're doing is just saying he equals unhappy. And the seems doesn't really have much meaning here. Same thing with the word looks. Your sister looks tired. Now we're just saying your sister equals tired. The dog appears frightened. Now, appears is a linking verb. We're just saying the dog equals frightened. frightened, excuse me. There's a few other linking verbs like become and smell and taste. Again, many of the verbs for senses are linking verbs. Remain is another linking verb. So I don't have too many linking verbs. What you're seeing on the screen is the majority of them. They're a fairly rare type of verb. Now I want you to notice these words in red. The first sentence we saw was, he seems unhappy. Your sister looks tired. The dog appears frightened. Tired, unhappy, frightened. All of these words are what we call predicate adjectives. Now remember, a predicate, to predicate on something means to explain. And so what we are doing is we are predicating on the subject. We're explaining something about the subject. So adjectives that come after a linking verb tell us or predicate on the subject. So that's why we call them predicate adjectives. Now we will actually mark that in our tree, but we won't worry about that right now. So let's take a look at this word become. She became sad. Let me see here, sad is a predicate adjective, but I can also say she became a pilot. Well, now a pilot, is that a predicate adjective? Well, no. In fact, that's a predicate noun because a pilot, and pilot is a noun phrase, and when we add the determiner a to it, we have another noun phrase. So this is called a predicate noun. Still, it's predicating on the subject. It's telling us about the subject. She equals a pilot, and it's not an adjective. So an intransitive verb and a linking verb are often somewhat confusing. Sometimes they look alike, and it's difficult to tell which one is which. So there are a few tests that you can do to determine whether you have a VI or a VL, if you're not sure. So intransitive verbs can end sentences. I can just say, I slept, end of story. They can also be followed by adverbs. I slept restlessly. On the other hand, linking verbs cannot end sentences. So we can't just say, he seems. That's ungrammatical. So again, if you're looking at a verb and you're not sure whether it's a VI or a VL, try to end the sentence with the word. And that will be pretty obvious if you have a linking verb because it won't make sense. The second part is that we note that linking verbs can't be followed by adverbs immediately. So I cannot say, he seems restlessly. Again, because linking verbs are kind of semantically vacuous, meaning they don't really have a lot of meaning on their own. They're just linking things together. However, I can say, he seems restless lately. Restless is an adjective here, again, a predicate adjective, which is what we would expect to find after a linking verb. And we can add an adverb after that, but we can't have them followed directly by an adverb. So linking verbs must be followed by either a noun phrase or an adjective phrase that refers back to the subject. So if we see a noun phrase like she became a pilot is a noun phrase, we might be tempted to say that looks like a direct object, but it's not. It's a predicate noun phrase of a linking verb because really a pilot just refers back to she, the subject. So here is our linking verb formula. And again, you can look at each of these components and you can read the description of the formula and follow along with each of the parts. A complete sentence containing a linking verb must have a noun phrase acting as a subject, followed by the linking verb. This must be followed by either a noun phrase that functions as a predicate noun or an adjective phrase that functions as a predicate adjective. Now, note the curly braces here. with the noun phrase and the adjective phrase. These curly braces mean that either one or the other structure in the braces must be present for this to be a complete sentence. So it's like an either or indicator here. So this is not optional. One or the other has to be there. Okay, so that's the end of that. We discussed a little bit about intransitive verbs and linking verbs. Please stay tuned for the next video. We're going to be talking about the beginning of modern English.